folks in from the waiting room. Thank you for joining us this evening. Give me 1 second. Okay. Happy to see you all. Thank you for joining. Okay. Thank you for joining. Okay, so good evening, everyone. My name is John Blasco. I am the Deputy Chief of Staff to Congressmember Dan Goldman, and I will be moderating our discussion tonight. Thank you for logging on. Just some housekeeping and format guidelines for tonight. Congressman Goldman is going to give some opening remarks, and then we're going to move forward to questions and answers. Given the audience and given that, folks have many questions here, I apologize in advance, but I will need to cut speakers off as we move along. I will be sharing some pre-submitted questions that have been sent in by constituents, as well as calling on individuals who use the raise hand feature to ask a question. When I call your name, I will ask you to unmute so that you can ask your question, but we only have time for one question per constituent. So once your question is asked, you will be muted to allow for additional constituents to speak. We unfortunately cannot have any follow-up questions or have a back and forth discussion between the congressman and yourself. I also ask that if your question has been asked by another constituent, please try to ask a different one so that we can get through as many topics as possible. I also cannot allow long context prior to your question. I understand that folks want to give an opening before questions, but for the sake of time, I ask that folks keep their questions just to one to allow your neighbors and constituents of New York 10 to ask questions as well. Thank you in advance, and I apologize because we will not be able to get through every single constituent who wants to ask a question. But with that, let's begin, and I will pass it over to Congressman Dan Goldman for opening remarks.
Thanks very much, John. It's great to see everybody. Appreciate you joining what I guess is our 7th town hall this year. I just think in this time when there is so much going on, when so many of our communities are hurting, and it seems like every day there's another dramatic attack on either American people or our democracy by the president and his administration, that it's really important for me, at least, to be available to speak to you all about what I'm seeing down here in Washington. Last week we celebrated, or I should say we memorialized 9/11, and I met again with a number of survivors and first responders, so many of whom are falling ill now because of the exposure to the toxic air around Ground Zero in the aftermath of 9/11. And I'm aggressively pushing my bill that would permanently fund the World Trade Center Health Program. It's something that we were pushing very hard last week, and will continue to do so through the end of the year when hopefully we can get it passed. We're seeing, I don't have to tell many of you this, but we're seeing immigrant communities completely under attack by this administration, lawless administration, this authoritarian administration. I've been out front leading that effort to push back against these terror efforts that's really going after not just immigrant communities, but every community of color in this country, regardless of whether you're a citizen or not. And the point is fear, and they have added so much money to the ICE budget that it is the size of a large military right now, and that's the way they are treating it, including a murder or a death this weekend in Illinois. To that end, I've introduced the No Secret Police Act, which would unmask ICE agents. And I'm also spearheading a litigation. Finally, we have some standing to litigate members of Congress against ICE for refusing to allow us to do our oversight responsibilities and review and see detention centers where nonviolent, non-criminal immigrants are being detained for extremely long periods of time in inhumane conditions. And so we're going to continue to fight that in every way, including through the courts. And then, of course, we have a massive affordability crisis in New York. People are struggling to make ends meet. Rents are increasing, grocery prices are rising, and in response, rather than to actually keep the campaign promises that Donald Trump and the Republicans made, they are going after Medicaid, going after Medicare, going after Social Security, going after food stamps. They are trying to make life much harder for those people who are struggling to make ends meet. Also, they can cut taxes for their billionaire buddies. And I'm down here in DC fighting tooth and nail to make those Republicans in Congress who voted for those cuts to pay at the ballot box next year and before that as well. And then the last thing I will just add before I turn it around back over to John is we are really facing a full-scale attack on our democracy. And it seems like something new is happening every day. Even in the aftermath of the tragic shooting of Charlie Kirk, now Donald Trump is using that to go after people's First Amendment rights. The party that claims so much support for free speech is literally trying to undermine any organizations or entities or people even who say things that they don't like. And there's no question that Donald Trump is a wannabe mob boss, and I'm certainly trying to use my own experience prosecuting mob bosses to stand up to him, expose the impacts of his attacks, and make sure that we in the minority here in Congress do everything possible to stop him. And one of the things I'm doing, I think, to sort of lead those efforts in supporting democracy, defending democracy, is by trying to set a good example. I recently signed on to the Restore Act, which is a bipartisan bill that prohibits members of Congress and their families from trading stocks. And I think it's absolutely unacceptable for any members of Congress, whether they have inside information or not, to trade stocks. And so I'm a proud supporter of that bill, and I hope, given that it is bipartisan, that it can move through. And so that's a little bit of an overview, and kick it back over to you, John, so we can get to questions and answers.
Thank you, Congressman. As a reminder, I will be rotating between pre-submitted questions and live questions. We did receive a lot of pre-submitted questions, so I want to actually kick us off with two of those. The first question we have here is, as the conflict continues in Gaza, can you tell us how you view the situation that is going on?
Yeah, this is getting worse and worse by the day. And it is very clear to me that the Israeli government, led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, is using his own personal and political interests to absolutely use the power of Israel's military and Israel's government in completely unacceptable and horrific ways. I oppose the military invasion of Gaza. I oppose his efforts to prevent aid from getting into Gaza. And I oppose the expansion of the settlements and the violence in the West Bank. And I really want to be very clear, since March, when the Biden ceasefire ended, Prime Minister Netanyahu has gotten free rein from Donald Trump and has used it in the worst way possible. That is amoral and that is really counterproductive for the future of Israel. And this war very clearly must end now. To that, in order for that to happen, I do think that we need to be doing everything we can in Congress to put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. And to do that, we really need to put pressure on Donald Trump. Because during the Biden administration, the administration really did put guardrails around Prime Minister Netanyahu and his extreme right ministers. The Trump administration has not done that, and that's why we are seeing just this absolute reckless and destructive actions by this governing coalition. So we need to continue to put a lot of pressure on Donald Trump, either directly or through other Republicans in Congress who, have constituents who are very upset about this and may feel it at the ballot box, even if Donald Trump won't. I also think it's really important that we put pressure on Hamas to release the hostages. The reality is that the hostages need to come home for this war to end. And if we are only putting unilateral pressure on Israel, I think it incentivizes Hamas to continue to hold the hostages. And I think that we really do need to focus on being very strategic about getting to an end to this war. And, the last thing I'll say, because this is an issue that's, very personal to me. It's in many respects. And I want to emphasize that I strongly oppose Prime Minister Netanyahu and his governing coalition. But that does not mean that I don't support Israel and the Israeli people and Israel's right to exist as a Jewish and democratic state. And I think it's really important to keep those things separate. We don't believe Donald Trump is synonymous with the United States, even though I certainly oppose most, if not most of his policies, I'll say. And Prime Minister Netanyahu is not synonymous with Israel. And I think it is important that we absolutely stand up and speak out against what his government is doing, while recognizing that not only are those decisions not made by the Israeli people, but they certainly are not made by American Jews here in New York and elsewhere who are bearing the brunt of some anger with the rise of anti-Semitism. And I think that that's something that's very important. I just want to make sure we're keeping in mind.
Thank you, Congressmember. Another question that was submitted as well. As we prepare for the general mayoral election, where do you stand as it pertains to the Democratic nominee, Zoran Mamdani?
Well, look, I had a very good conversation with Zoran shortly after the primary, and we share many of the same goals for the city, especially the need to lower costs and make life more affordable again. We've actually worked together in the past on a pilot program for free bus routes. And if he is elected mayor, I certainly look forward to working with him on these shared goals and to make New York City the best place that it can be. This is an official event, so to speak. I'm in my congressional office with my congressional pin, so I can't really discuss the specifics of the campaign or the election, but let me just touch on a couple of things that may or may not be relevant to that. As mayor of New York, as any mayor of New York knows, he will be responsible for representing all New Yorkers. And there are 1.3 million Jewish New Yorkers. The FBI recently released its hate crime statistics, and a full 70% of religious-based hate crimes are anti-Semitic. And they have now become much more violent. And we've seen arsons and murders and actual violent attacks against Jews. And many Jews in New York City are scared. And it is the job of the mayor not only to make sure that he or she is not using anti-Semitic rhetoric or rhetoric that is perceived and understood by many to be anti-Semitic, but that he is condemning such rhetoric and that there is a concrete plan to combat this surge in anti-Semitism. Now, I recognize there are a lot of Jewish New Yorkers who are strongly in support of Zoran, and I think that's great. But I do hear very frequently from other Jewish constituents who are really scared and worried about what the city will look like under a potential Mamdani administration. And as the co-chair of the task force to combat anti-Semitism in Congress, this is a really, really important issue to me. And so I am hoping to meet with Zoran again and continue to have our frank conversations about this topic and others. And I'll continue to urge him to release a concrete plan to combat anti-Semitism, just to make sure that all New Yorkers, including Jews, feel safe.
Thank you, Congressmember. I'm going to jump to some live questions now. Just some reminders, please. No context before your question. We want to get to as many questions as possible. Keep your question to one question. And if you have heard your question asked already, please try to share a different question. We want to get to as many different topics as possible. I apologize in advance for cutting you off, but I am just trying to keep us on time. I also apologize if I pronounce your name wrong. If I do, please just feel free to correct me. So with that being said, I would like to call on the first speaker, Ilaria Marja. I'm going to ask you to unmute. Ilaria, asking you to unmute. We'll come back to you. Next, I'm going to ask Marvin Siporin to unmute.
Um,
There you go, Marvin.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Wonderful responses. The government is racing towards a possible shutdown, and I'm wondering what House Democrats feel they can concretely gain in these negotiations to roll back some of the Republican power grabs and destructive activities, which people are feeling directly. And I don't know whether the Republicans in Congress are even aware of it.
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's really the primary focus of what is going on right now. Um, as you saw from the big ugly bill, which the Republicans were able to ram through with only Republican votes through a process called reconciliation. There are not that many opportunities where the Democrats, especially in the Senate, where there's still the filibuster, have leverage right now. The Republicans control everything in Washington. And I have been a strong proponent since last December for using that leverage that we have to make sure that we get some of our priorities in any budget that's passed, including a so-called continuing resolution. I was disappointed in March when that did not happen. And I and my colleagues have been working very hard to make sure that it does not happen again, because a so-called clean CR or something that just continues the status quo, as you point out, Marvin, is simply not okay. The Republicans are trying to destroy our government as we know it, and we simply cannot go along with that anymore. And so I do think, obviously I'm not necessarily in the negotiating room, but my view and what I've been advocating to our leadership and to the Senate Democrats is that we need to hold out to make sure that this administration doesn't enter into a particular deal with Democrats on one day and then the next day turn around and undermine it and undo it by either doing what's called impounding, which is not spending the money, or rescinding, which is just getting rid of the money that we have appropriated. We have the power of the purse, and I think it's really important that we put some guardrails around that. Healthcare is also was the main target of the big ugly bill, and is going to not only devastate 17 million Americans who will lose their insurance, but many, many, many others, if not everybody, because costs are going to go up, hospitals are going to close. It's going to significantly hamper service that can be provided in community health benefit centers. It's a massive, massive problem, and I think we are coalescing around holding the line on healthcare broadly. And I think it remains to be seen what exactly that means. It's obviously a large area, including Medicaid, including the ACA, and the premium tax credits, including cancer research. So there's a lot that's in discussion, but most importantly, we are trying to urge our Senate colleagues to hold strong, even if that means that we have the very unfortunate outcome of a shutdown. We have to stand up and we have to fight to make sure that we are using our leverage effectively when we have it. And nobody wants a shutdown. They're terrible for everyone. But I do think that the Republicans think they can walk all over us, and they will continue to do that until we stand up. And so I hope we do that.
Thank you, Congressmember. Next question pre-submitted. Can you speak a little bit about the Department of Homeland Security and the actions that ICE have been taking, especially in New York City? What have you been doing about that?
Yeah, look, I mean, it is almost just unfathomable what's going on. I mean, first of all, in this big ugly bill, notwithstanding all of the resources that have been put by this administration into civil immigration enforcement, not criminal, civil, they added $45 billion for the Department of Homeland, for ICE, actually, just ICE alone, which is a massive, massive amount of money. And they're essentially creating a military. ICE has been acting like a military where they are roaming around the streets and the courthouses, including one in my district office right in downtown Manhattan, and then another across the street at 26 Federal Plaza. And they are literally snatching people out of courtrooms who are trying to lawfully enter this country through asylum or other lawful means. So when we heard all these promises about, the worst of the worst and murderers and convicted criminals that Donald Trump talked about on the campaign trail, it's actually the exact opposite. And what they are doing is they are just trying to ratchet up their numbers as much as possible. So they're going to the easiest targets, which are the people who are following the law. So 70% of people, according to recent numbers, of immigrants who have been detained have no criminal record. And these are people who are trying to find a better life here. And the absolute terrorizing of the communities and this effort to put all these resources into deporting as many people as possible is destructive to the fabric of our country, and frankly is not what this country that I love is all about. And so I've been taking the lead in a number of different ways. I mentioned earlier the No Secret Police Act, which bans ICE agents from wearing masks. We've got over 100 co-sponsors now. Joined, that lawsuit with 11 other members because I have repeatedly tried to get into ICE detention centers where they are holding nonviolent, non-criminal immigrants for as much as 2 weeks in facilities that have no beds, very little food, no showers, they stink, and there's very little hygiene there. In fact, it's so bad that even the Department of Justice admitted in court that these conditions violated the Constitution. And we have a right to be able to conduct oversight by statute, not just our constitutional oversight role, but by statute, we have a right to inspect Department of Homeland Security detention facilities, and they are not letting us in. And that's why we filed this lawsuit. They are now keeping over 100 immigrants at the Brooklyn MDC, which, for those in Brooklyn who know, has had a lot of problems in the past and is not a very well run or well kept prison for criminals, those either charged or convicted. And so we're pushing every angle we can to lift up and raise, what is going on, to expose really what is going on, because so much of what we get from this administration is just outright lies. And so I'm certainly trying as much as I can to get the truth out there and fight back in every possible way that we can, whether it's lawsuits or rallies or legislation, in every way available to us.
Thank you, Congressmember, and thank you for speaking about Brooklyn MDC, as we did receive some constituent inquiries from Sunset Park regarding the conditions at Brooklyn MDC, along with the Bureau of Prisons. Next, I want to move to a raised hand attendee. Next, I'm going to call on Annie Basluk, asking you to unmute, Annie, if you can ask your question.
Hi there. Congressman Goldman, you claim to oppose the military invasion in Gaza and West Bank settlements, but you haven't co-sponsored any of the bills in Congress that would limit military aid and demand a ceasefire. I'm wondering how you can oppose these actions without supporting these solutions that have, been available, and what concrete actions you'll take instead to address the crisis.
Right. Well, I do oppose it. And I think what is challenging is to figure out what the right solution is. I don't believe that withholding all offensive military aid to Israel is the right solution for a number of reasons, including that Israel is surrounded by enemies who have, as we've seen over the last 2 years, tried to attack them and destroy them. I do think that we need to figure out a pathway, and there's a lot of discussion going on between me and my colleagues right now, where we can put targeted pressure that prevents this ongoing military operation that continues to stand up and prevent the expansion of settlements and settler violence in the West Bank. I am on the West Bank Sanctions Act that Congressman Nadler is leading, that would restore the sanctions against settlers in the West Bank that the Biden administration had put on and the Trump administration had withdrawn. There are lots of ways, to oppose something, and it's my personal view that the ones that have been proposed thus far through legislation, other than the West Bank Sanctions Act, are not the strategic solution that we need to end this war. What we need is for Donald Trump to take a much more active role, like Joe Biden did, and put a lot more pressure on the Israeli government. And we need to figure out a way to to incentivize both Hamas and Israel to come to the table and to end this war. And that's where my focus is.
Thank you, Congressmember. When we first started these town halls, we received a very similar question, and we've heard them time and time again at our town halls. So this submitted question is, what are Democrats doing to fight back the Trump administration?
Yes, that is a good question. I think right now, for sure, with this September 30th funding deadline, this is one of those few opportunities that I mentioned where we actually do have legislative leverage. As we saw from the big ugly bill, the Republicans jammed that through with no Democratic votes. They're in the majority. They have the presidency. And so they were able to do that, even though it was incredibly damaging to millions and millions of Americans. There are a lot of things that we are doing. I mentioned, obviously, the lawsuit. Where we can, we are coordinating with nonprofit groups and state's attorney general filing lawsuits against Donald Trump's executive orders. I think over 400 have been filed, and at various points, more than 100 of his actions have been paused. The Supreme Court is not helping us as it relates to that, and it's something that I've been bringing out a lot more and paying more attention to, because the Supreme Court is effectively overruling these lower courts with no explanation, with no briefing, in a quote temporary way, but they're allowing Donald Trump's policies to continue forward. And even if they were then to be overturned later on, a lot of the damage is already done, and you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And I think that's a very intentional effort by the Supreme Court to avoid accountability, but to help with Donald Trump's agenda. Rallies are, I think, more important than many realize, and especially in battleground districts. And I say that from experience. I've been out to Staten Island, Nicole Maliotakis, to New York 1, Nick LaLota. I know a number of people have been up to Mike Lawler's district in Rockland County in Westchester. These are districts that are in play, and I promise you that the more attention that we are bringing to the damaging actions of these members of Congress, the more impact it has, and the less likely they are to go along with Donald Trump's extremist agenda. It didn't happen with the big ugly bill, and I was very disappointed about that because so many of them, including the ones I mentioned, really voted against the interest of many of their constituents. But we're going to keep that up, and I think that's a way to stop the egregious actions now, but it's also a way to flip the House next November, which is an absolute must do, so that we can finally put a check and balance through the majority on Donald Trump. And then finally, it's the letters that you all write and the emails and the calls, they do matter. They do matter. I have essentially, as an example of how they matter, I've burned a lot of my relationships with the New York Republicans because I've very directly exposed what their votes were for. And they are not happy with me for doing that. And the reason they're not happy is because they are trying to gaslight their constituents, and we can't let them. And so that's a lot of what we're trying to do. Many people have heard about a discharge petition. I think it's important to remember we don't have subpoena power, and without Republicans, we cannot bring legislation to the floor. So we are trying to use every lever that we have to push back and to expose them. And according to the polling, I think we're making some progress, but we've got a long way to go.
Thank you, Congressmember. Next, I would like to call on Jonathan Lewinson. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you for taking this question and for doing this call. Long before many of us had even heard the name Mamdani, you and both your elections were talking about how important it is to bring affordable housing to New York City and specifically to the district. It's obviously a city thing, but can you help us understand what you're doing from the federal level to improve the affordable housing problem that we have across the district?
Yeah, thanks for that question. I think it's an important point. And affordable housing is a massive issue. Housing generally, the affordability crisis is both affordable housing, but it's also market rent. Our vacancy rate in New York City is, I think, last I checked, 1.4%, which is the lowest that it has ever been. And that, of course, it puts inflationary pressures on rent. The reality, in my view, is that we need our city and state government, especially, to invest in housing. I am working on a number of different ways in Congress to help build affordable housing. One of the provisions in the big ugly bill actually is one that I pushed, and it was part of a bipartisan bill last term that expanded the low-income housing tax credit, which is one of the few federal programs that allows for affordable housing to be built. And it can actually, with the change that was made, it can double the amount of affordable housing that uses federal bonds. So that's a positive. And what I am trying to focus on is to build partnerships with the private sector as well as the government, and to make sure that the private sector is contributing more to the communities than they have in the past. We're working on a project in the Brooklyn Marine Terminal right now that where we have been negotiating with the city for over a year now, and we are up to 40% affordable units in the new housing that would be built there. And I think that's a model that we need to continue to do. And then the most important thing that I'm focused on, given my background as a prosecutor, is enforcement and accountability. Part of the reason why these upzonings and redevelopments often don't work is that there's no accountability for the agreement that was made originally. And 7 years down the road, it changes significantly. And I am insistent on making sure that doesn't happen. And we've built in a lot of guardrails in the Brooklyn Marine Terminal redevelopment, if it does pass, that would ensure that the original plan is actually executed. And so I just don't, there's not enough money in city and state government to build the amount of housing that we need. And so we do need to recognize that we have to have public-private partnerships. But as a public official, we need to get better deals out of those partnerships, and we need to enforce them, those deals all the way through.
Thank you, Congressmember. We have been hearing a lot from constituents, especially in neighborhoods like Chinatown, Sunset Park, Red Hook, Gowanus, about SNAP benefits. How are you fighting to restore healthcare and SNAP benefits?
Well, as I mentioned, one of the things we're really focused on as it relates to healthcare is this 9/30, the September 30 deadline, and making sure that we are holding the line and adding back in some of the cuts that the Republicans had made during the big ugly bill. We're pushing really hard on SNAP, and a lot of it is political, but there are other ways that I think it's really important to try to help. One of the bills that I am sponsoring would, first of all, provide funding for the victims of SNAP theft. We had this it's about $40 million. We had this in the December budget bill, and then Elon Musk and Donald Trump took it out. But what is happening is that when there is theft of SNAP benefits, you need the federal government to essentially authorize the restitution for the victims. And these, of course, are people who depend on this money to eat, the basic necessity of eating. And they're not given that money back unless Congress passes a bill. And so we were close in December, and we're still pushing very, very hard. I'm also pushing to have a bill that would sort of bring up to current day technology for EBT cards that should not be so easy to steal and use. And so we can have anti-fraud chip technology in them. Now, these are things that will be prospectively helpful, but we're going to continue to push aggressively to restore the cuts to SNAP because it's debilitating for the state government. It's debilitating for those people who rely on those benefits to eat. And we're making this affordable. Not we, the Republicans are just continuing to exacerbate this affordability crisis by taking away things like healthcare and food, basic needs. And so it's a combination of legislation and political pressure, especially on vulnerable Republicans.
Thank you, Congressmember. The next speaker I would like to call on is Steve Botticelli. Steve, asking you to unmute.
Yes. Hi, Representative Goldman. You spoke at the beginning about putting pressure on both Israel and Hamas in order to end the genocide. Of course, we have no leverage against Hamas in every form of leverage to use with Israel. I heard your answer to the earlier questioner about why you won't
Steve,
support.
can you ask your question, please?
Yes. I'm wondering how you justify disregarding the wishes of the constituents in your very progressive district that you support the Block the Bombs Act.
Well, look, I disagree with you that we have no influence over Hamas. Um, I believe that the reason why, one of the critical reasons why this war is still going is because the international pressure on Israel has grown when it has not grown on Hamas. And Hamas and Iran pay very, very close attention to public opinion, public pressure. That's actually the thing they pay the most attention to. So I think that if we are all pushing against Hamas and pressuring Hamas to release the hostages, that is an effective way, and that does mean something. And we can also be pushing against pressuring those countries that have relationships with Hamas and that are the intermediaries. There's no reason why we can't pressure them to pressure Hamas as well. And so, I think that the reality of the situation is that unless you think that it doesn't matter that whether the hostages return home, that seems to be, a requirement for any end to the war. And the Block the Bombs Act does not address that. And it's my view that we need to make sure that we are pressuring Prime Minister Netanyahu, and there are a number of different ways of doing that, but that we also can and should pressure Hamas. And I think, frankly, it's a cop-out to say that we don't have an avenue into Hamas, because if this continues with just unilateral pressure, then I think it's less likely that this war will end. And that's really what my focus is. My only focus is on ending the war and figuring out the best way and the most strategic way to get that done.
Thank you, Congressmember. We received a question about lowering the cost, especially in terms of tariffs. In particular, communities and small business owners, mom and pop shops in Chinatown, are fearful because they're having to deal with the impact of these tariffs, and community members are not going to use the business and buy the merch and the produce, whatever it is that they are selling. Can you talk a little bit about tariffs and what you are doing to address that?
Yeah, the tariffs have been devastating for small businesses, for a number of different reasons. Chinatown has many small businesses, and the community very much depends on them. And there's no margin here for these small businesses to increase prices to pay for the tariffs. But if they don't do that, they can't stay in business. And so what is happening is the squeeze is so significant that some are going out of business and some are losing business because they have to raise prices. Because we know that tariffs really are just a tax on Americans that are driving up the cost. You mentioned the food and ingredients. I visited a jerk chicken restaurant in Park Slope a couple weeks ago, and I was speaking to Fanny, the owner, and she said to me that because of the tariffs and the increasing costs on her ingredients, many of which come from Mexico, her net profit went from 30% to zero. And that's just in a few months, and that's just one example. And so what I am really trying to do is make sure we understand how these tariffs are impacting businesses and consumers on the ground, and then lifting that up and making sure that people recognize that maybe the reason why the costs are up is because of the tariffs, and that the tariffs are not having the benefits that Donald Trump says. And increasingly, polling shows they're very unfavorable. And in our political system, the more unfavorable the policy is, the more likely it is that people will change their mind. And so, I'm also pushing some of the larger corporations to speak out more aggressively against the tariffs, because they are also being impacted by them. So this is not just a small business thing, even though small businesses are affected probably more than large businesses. But this has to be a unified effort to convey to the president that his totally unstrategic and reckless tariffs are really hurting the American people. They're not helping anybody.
Thank you, Congressmember. Next, I would like to call on Melissa Schiffman. Melissa, I'm going to ask you to unmute.
Hi, Congressman. Thanks for holding a town hall. My question is regarding healthcare. I have a rare disease which causes us to get the most expensive healthcare that's offered. The premiums are really high, the coverage is terrible, and treatments that need pre-authorizations are increasingly being denied. I'm curious to know what Congress can do to make healthcare more affordable. I know this current climate's not great, but still.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was actually having a conversation with a Republican colleague today just about this topic because it is more bipartisan. The problem is the different parties have different solutions. And in the end, it does require, I think, more significant changes to really address the system. But there are things that we can do and that I think we may do. The first is to completely reform PBMs, which are the intermediaries between pharmaceutical companies and consumers, but they're often now owned by the insurance companies. And it's effectively collusion to jack up the price and give all of the profit, to give more and more profit to the insurance companies and these middlemen. That's something that has a lot of bipartisan support, and I think would definitely bring costs down. I do think that one of the things we need to think about is we certainly need to focus on insurance costs and making insurance more accessible and affordable. But there's another way of looking at the system, which is from just a pure cost perspective. And one of the things that I thought President Biden did that was great was allowed Medicare and Medicaid, allowed CMS to negotiate pharmaceutical prices. Obviously, given there are so many Medicaid and Medicare beneficiaries, they had a lot of negotiating power, and the price of those 10 drugs went down significantly. I think we can expand that and try to figure out a way of doing that such that it also impacts the insurance companies. But we should have similar pricing here in the United States that we do abroad. And oftentimes it's far more expensive here than it is abroad. And so there are, I think, two different ways of attacking the healthcare system. One is to reduce to streamline insurance, as you point out, make pre-authorization much easier. I met with Blue Cross they own Blue Cross Blue Shield, Anthem, and they were talking about how they're trying to integrate AI to be able to really streamline the pre-authorization process. And I think that's something that has a lot of potential. And so we need to be creative and we need to be aggressive because there are too many people like you who are suffering from the weight and the expense, and it's just going up. It's not, unfortunately, going down.
Thank you, Congressmember. We received some inquiries, especially from some of our young people in the district who have been working with some of our settlement houses on gun violence. What are you doing as a member of Congress to address the acts of gun violence in our district?
I take a very holistic approach to gun violence. We need to continue to push for basic common sense gun safety regulation that's generally supported by a supermajority of Americans. When you look at universal background checks or red flag laws, safe storage laws, even the assault weapons ban is supported by more than half of all Americans, and I'm a strong supporter of it. And I continue to advocate for it. I push for it. I try to, basically, I'm kind of done. I'm completely done with this whole notion that Republicans always use after another mass shooting that, oh, we shouldn't politicize these mass shootings. In my mind, that's BS. They are happening because our political system is not working properly. And we need to be applying as much pressure on the Republicans to take care of their constituents before they take care of the gun industry. But I'm also doing a lot of work on the demand side in communities in the district. I introduced a bill that would, the Prosper Act, that would significantly increase the amount of money that is available for grants for nonprofits, NGOs on the ground doing really good work of trying to stop the desire and demand for guns within the community. And so my view is we got to do it on both sides because it's such a massive problem. And then the last thing I'll add is mental health treatment, which I think is just a really, really important issue for gun violence. Yes, because we do see a lot of mass shooters that are suffering from mental health issues, but public safety generally, homelessness, so mental health has grown, obviously has risen since the pandemic, during the pandemic, and even has stayed where it is. And it's part of the reason I'm pushing and will be rolling out this week the reintroduction of the Michelle Go Act, which would more than double the number of long-term acute care beds for Medicaid recipients who otherwise would not be able to get mental health care. And it's one of two bills to expand mental health access, mental health care for Medicaid recipients, because this is an equity issue. And all too often, if you can afford mental health care, you can get it. But if you can't afford it, you can't get it. And that is not the society we should be living in.
Thank you, Congressmember. Unfortunately, we're going to jump to the last question and then move to some closing remarks. But Congressmember, as the member of Congress representing the largest NYCHA development in Manhattan, Baruch Houses, and the largest development in Brooklyn, Red Hook, East and West, what can be done to protect NYCHA?
Well, we're doing everything that we can. We actually had a meeting down here with the chair of NYCHA and the CEO today to talk through some of the legislation some of the legislation, including my bill that would increase capital improvement funding by 70 billion, more than 30 billion for NYCHA. That is unlikely to pass anytime soon, but also some other legislation. And what we're really focused on right now is securing Section 8 and Section 9 vouchers and funding. NYCHA, a number of NYCHA units, now over 100, are starting to convert through a RAD PAC system that allows for private developers to renovate the decrepit and deteriorating buildings, but while maintaining all of the Section 9 benefits for NYCHA residents. And that is one pathway. I mean, NYCHA says it's probably their only pathway right now to getting the amount of money needed to do these renovations. And so we're really focused right now on preserving Section 8 and Section 9. I met with the New York Regional Director of HUD a couple of weeks ago to talk about how we can work together to make sure that we're doing this. And thus far, it sounds like there are no plans for significant cuts to Section 8 or Section 9. And so we're monitoring that closely and advocating very strongly for that.
Thank you, Congressmember. And thank you, everyone, for your questions. Please know you can reach out to our office. I do want to turn it back to you, Congressmember Goldman, just for some closing remarks.
Thanks, John, and thank you all for joining. Thank you for your questions. Obviously, there's a lot going on around the country, around the world, and these are scary times. And I certainly understand that. I feel that. I don't get a lot of sleep these days because I'm just trying to think of different ways, different levers that we can push to stop this Trump train from taking over our government and undermining the values that we hold dear in this country, as well as all the funding and staffing that is needed for our government to function properly. Certainly, the number one objective for all of us that we're focused on is taking back the House next November. As I said, the same way of doing that also can help in the short term to pressure Republicans not to support some of these terrible policies that Trump and Republican leadership are trying to push through. And so we're going to need everybody, all hands on deck. This is really the only significant check that is available to us over the next year plus. It's very unlikely that we'll be able to flip the Senate, and we need to win one in order to stop what is going on. And so I certainly look forward to working on that and hopefully working with all of you together to protect our democracy, to flip the House, and make sure that we put the proper checks on Donald Trump. So thanks very much again for everyone for coming, and appreciate the questions, appreciate the interest, and I'll continue to work as hard as I possibly can to represent you as well as I can.
Thank you, Congressmember, and thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.